One of the largest and richest imperial houses in the world, the houses of the Romanovs, existed for 300 years and in just a year sank into the abyss. Some members of the dynasty were killed by the Bolsheviks, others managed to flee from Russia. The collapse of the royal house and the wanderings of the survivors are worth a series, which hasn't been filmed yet. In this episode of How It Was, we will tell you about the fate of the survived Romanovs after the revolution. You will find out why the European monarchs did not want to rescue the family of Nicholas II, how the great dukes and princesses turned into taxi drivers and music hall artists, how the Romanovs influenced world fashion, and why the misfortunes they experienced did not unite but only set the remnants of the dynasty at odds. But first, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new releases. Traditionally, the royal families had many children, so by the beginning of the fateful 1917, the imperial house of the Romanovs consisted of 65 people, mainly numerous cousins of Nicholas II and families of his uncles. Members of the royal family had large accounts in European banks, palaces throughout the empire, and innumerable jewelry. But Nicholas II and his relatives spent money on art, horses, cars, without any financial constraint. And the idea that it could end one day seemed all the more incredible. Until the very last, Nicholas II did not take seriously the events in the country, civil disorders, hunger, and strikes caused by the war and the collapse of the economy. In March 1917, no measures could change the outcome of what was happening. The Petrograd Soviet demanded the emperor's abdication, and he had to agree. On March 15, 1917, the Tsar abdicated in favor of his younger brother Mikhail, but the latter categorically refused to accept the throne. So just in one day, the huge empire was left without a ruler. At the time of Nicholas's abdication, he and his family had 15 months to live, which of course they did not suspect. Kept under arrest within his estate, the Tsar wrote letters to his mother, the Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna. She advised him to leave Russia with the help of her relatives. Maria Feodorovna, born as Danish Princess Dagmar, grew up with her grandmother, British Queen Victoria. After becoming the Empress, she maintained warm relationships with both her British and Danish relatives. Now, their help could come in handy more than ever. Nicholas II's cousin, George V, was sitting on the British throne. One can't help but notice the similarity between the brothers. Moreover, the two monarchs had excellent long-standing relationship. "I consider you my oldest and most loyal friend," wrote George to Nicholas. So he was the first to whom Nicholas II wrote after the February Revolution, asking for asylum for his family. And his brother, his best friend, the closest of European monarchs, refused. Historians later wrote, George V had a unique opportunity to save the Tsar's family if he weren't afraid to get on the wrong side of the new Russian government and his own people, who were extremely opposed to the Russian Tsar. George V practically signed the death warrant for the royal family. Meanwhile, the relatively lenient provisional government was replaced by the Bolsheviks, who took the royal family under strict arrest. In July 1919, Nicholas II, his wife, and 5 children were executed without trial, and it is still unclear who ordered it. The news about the murder of the royal family shook the world, which believed until the last moment that it was impossible to come to an agreement with the Bolsheviks. George V, King of Great Britain, who just a year ago completely refused to shelter the Russian relatives, wavered and sent the battleship Marlborough for his aunt, Empress Dowager Maria Feodorovna, who had lived in Crimea for the last year. On the morning of April 4, 1919, the ship arrived in Crimea, and a week later it headed for Constantinople. About a dozen Romanovs left Russia on board the Marlborough, including Maria Feodorovna, Nicholas II's sister Xenia, and his cousins, the Grand Dukes Nicholas and Peter. They left into the frightening unknown. All of the relatives of the deceased Tsar settled in the homes of European kings, their blood relatives. At first, they were received with great sympathy and warmth. However, this benevolence towards the refugees would end soon. One of the first to incur the wrath of his German hosts was Nicholas II's cousin, Kirill Vladimirovich. Since his brothers were killed by the Bolsheviks, it was he who was to become the new Tsar. So in 1924, Grand Duke Kirill proclaimed himself Kirill I, Emperor of all Russia in exile. However, this only worsened his life in Germany. Germany had already established diplomatic relations with the USSR and didn't want a self-proclaimed emperor in the country, so they just kicked him out of the country. Empress Maria Feodorovna and one of his uncles, Nikolai Nikolaevich, who found refuge in Italy and considered himself the heir to the throne, were bewildered by the ambitions of Grand Duke Kirill. Moreover, he was recognized by most of the Russian immigration. Until now, Russians abroad have not come to a consensus about the true heir of Nicholas II. Luxury disappeared from the life of the Romanovs. European monarchs were not going to keep their poor relatives for a long time at their own expense. Therefore, the aristocrats sold everything they managed to bring from Russia. The brilliant aunt of Nicholas II, Duchess Maria Pavlovna, was the most practical of all. In 1918, she handed over the valuables to the Swedish embassy in St. Petersburg and ordered her valet to send the jewels to her in France with the Swedish diplomatic mission. But alas, she died before they were delivered. Maria Pavlovna did not even have a chance to inform the rest of the Romanovs about these valuables taken to Sweden. 2 pillowcases full of royal treasures were found in the archives of the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs only in 2009. The Swedish Embassy for Foreign Affairs returned the jewels to the Romanov family. Their total cost amounted to €2 million, $2.9 million. The Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna also found herself almost empty-handed. She was over 70 and couldn't work. Having settled with her daughters back home in Denmark, she was in need. Fortunately, her 2 nephews, the Danish and British princes, supported her with money. Felix Yusupov and his wife, the daughter of Nicholas II's sister, Duchess Xenia, were doing relatively well. By today's standards, the Yusupovs were oligarchs. Their contemporaries joked that even the Yusupovs themselves did not know what and in what quantities they had. The Yusupovs took jewelry and 2 Rembrandt paintings with them, and after selling all this, managed to buy a mansion in France. Later, when they were short of money, the Yusupovs opened the IRFE fashion house. Impoverished Russian aristocrats worked there as designers, seamstresses, cutters. However, the Great Depression, this business went bankrupt. And the closest friend of Felix Yusupov, the youngest Grand Duke Dmitry, with whom they killed Rasputin just a few years ago, was in the champagne trade. All the Romanovs whose age and health allowed them to work found themselves in different spheres. Nicholas II's cousins, Maria Pavlovna, made lace and embroidery. Her sister became a fashion model. By the way, at that time, the Romanov family had a really big influence on French fashion. Styles and colors and à la Russe became a trend among wealthy ladies. Embroidery, sundresses, and even stylized kokoshniks embroidered with pearls. All this turned out to be the height of fashion in the 1920s. Mathilde Kshesinka, a ballerina and wife of Nicholas II's cousins, had to return to ballet. Even though she was 50, she opened a dance school to support her husband. Their son worked as a door-to-door salesman. He was selling wine, delivering it on a bicycle. The son of Grand Duke Nikolai Konstantinovich worked in Paris as a taxi driver. The sister of Nicholas II earned some money by painting, and one of the aunts of the executed monarch sang in music halls. Some of the Romanovs got allowances from George V, but the payments stopped after the death of the British monarch in 1936. But those who managed to win the favour of the British crown felt like strangers. When the great-grandson of Maria Feodorovna, Andrei Romanov, was walking in the park of Windsor Castle, he ran into a very young Elizabeth II. After that, it was pointed out to his relatives that their presence in those places where the British monarchs spend their time was undesirable. It's been 100 years since the battleship Marlborough took the refugees from the Romanov house to Europe. Now, there must be 100 descendants of the family under the royal name. They are members of various associations of the Romanovs and social movements. They still haven't reached an agreement about who is the main Romanov today, the Russian Tsar by right of blood. There are 2 of them. Meet Maria Romanova, granddaughter of the Grand Duke Kirill, who considered himself the rightful heir to the crown. Since his title was neither confirmed or denied, 67-year-old Maria Romanova is considered the head of the Russian imperial house. She's also recognized by the Russian Orthodox Church. She lives in a small Madrid apartment and her son Georgie is the next contender for the title. But meanwhile, he's working as an energy expert and is about to get married. And here is the second contender for the phantom royal throne, Andrew Romanov. He is 98 years old. He is the grandnephew of Nicholas II himself, the grandson of his sister Xenia. Ever since he was born, his mother told him that the Russian monarchy would certainly revive, and he would become a Tsar. Andrew Romanov grew up in Britain and first came to Russia during World War II as part of the Allied forces. After the war, he lived in the United States, worked as a realtor, jeweler, and even a carpenter. Both heirs to the throne have their own legal arguments, but they belong to opposing organizations. Maria Romanova belongs to the so-called Russian imperial house, and Andrew Romanov is the head of the Romanov Family Association. Both organizations can't stand each other and do not communicate with each other. However, there is a lot of bright personalities in the Romanov house. Nicoletta Romanov is an actress and singer from Italy. Rostislav Romanov from the USA is an artist whose paintings can be viewed on his Instagram. In 2017, he designed a funeral watch dedicated to the victims of the October Revolution. Michael Romanov is an American portrait painter, and British France's Alexander Matthew Romanov is a famous fashion photographer who is also known as a bachelor from a Ukrainian dating show. They all earn their daily bread. The legendary riches of the Romanovs are lost or spent by their ancestors. However, all the Romanovs today can freely visit their historical homeland where they've been welcome since the 1990s. Every year on July 17th, the descendants of the imperial family gather in St. Petersburg to honor the memory of the last Tsar, whose death changed the fate of not only the dynasty, but the entire Russian Empire.
Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel to enjoy new episodes of How It Was.